I tightened my grip on the small wrapped bouquet I had brought for my late wife, even though she had been gone for 5 years. "I'm sorry, Mr. Bennett," the hostess said, her smile disappearing. "We can't seat you today." I frowned. There must be a mistake. I reserved booth 7 for noon. I even called yesterday to confirm. She glanced nervously toward the manager's office. "The reservation is here," she admitted quietly. "But we've been instructed not to seat you unless a family member is with you." The conversations around the diner began to fade as nearby customers turned toward us. "What are you talking about?" I asked. The manager stepped forward before she could answer. "Sir, your son explained your condition to us. He said you sometimes become confused and make unsafe decisions. We were told to contact him immediately if you arrived alone." For a second, I honestly thought I had misheard him. "My son said that." He nodded with obvious sympathy. "We're only trying to protect you." "Protect me?" On my 72nd birthday. At the diner where my wife and I had celebrated every birthday and anniversary for more than 40 years. "I don't need protecting," I said evenly. "I need the table I reserved." "I'm afraid we can't do that." He gestured politely toward the entrance. "I'm asking you to leave." I looked around the room. Some people avoided my eyes. Others stared with the uncomfortable pity usually reserved for someone who didn't understand what was happening around them. No one saw an independent retired engineer. They saw an old man whose own family had warned strangers about him. The cold air hit my face the moment I stepped outside. For several seconds, I simply stood there on the sidewalk, staring through the diner's front window at booth 7. It sat empty, exactly where Alina and I always sat. She used to laugh every year because the waitress already knew our order before we opened the menus. Alina always insisted birthdays weren't about gifts. They were about honoring the people who stayed beside you long enough to grow old together. I had kept the tradition after losing her. Not because it made the grief easier. Because it reminded me that love deserved to be remembered instead of hidden away. I looked down at the bouquet in my hands. The flowers suddenly felt foolish. A family walked past me toward the entrance. The little boy asked his father why I wasn't going inside. His father lowered his voice before answering. I didn't hear the words. I didn't need to. The look he gave me was enough. It was the same look the manager had worn. Concern. Pity. The kind reserved for someone people believed couldn't be trusted to care for himself. When had that started? Over the past few months, little things had happened that I brushed aside. A neighbor had casually asked whether I was still driving. My bank manager had insisted on verifying my identification twice before allowing a routine withdrawal. Even two old friends had begun speaking more slowly whenever we met for coffee, as if they expected me to struggle keeping up. I had laughed every incident off. Now every one of them returned at once. A quiet voice interrupted my thoughts. "Mr. Bennett." I turned. A woman around 40 stood a few feet away, holding the hand of a little girl no older than 8. Both carried winter coats dusted with snowflakes. The woman studied me carefully before glancing toward the diner entrance. "I'm Laura," she said softly. "My daughter and I come here almost every Saturday." I forced a polite smile. "I'm afraid you've caught me on a rather embarrassing day." She hesitated only a moment before stepping closer. "I know." Her eyes settled on the bouquet in my hands. Then she leaned toward me, just enough so no one else could hear. "I know exactly why they turned you away." My heartbeat slowed. "What do you mean?" She looked back through the diner's window toward the manager's office. Then she whispered words that made the cold disappear completely. "Because your son has been saying this about you for months." For several seconds, I couldn't answer. I simply stared at Laura, searching her face for some sign that she had mistaken me for someone else. "My son," I finally asked, "Daniel." She nodded slowly. "I'm so sorry." Her daughter looked up at her, sensing something serious, but Laura gently squeezed the little girl's hand before turning back to me. "I didn't know your name until today," she said, "but I recognized your face the moment you walked into the diner." I swallowed hard. "You've seen Daniel here?" "Yes." She glanced toward the windows again before lowering her voice. "About 6 weeks ago." The words landed heavier than the cold ever could. Laura motioned toward a bench just outside the diner. "If you don't mind sitting for a minute, I think you deserve to know what I heard." I sat without realizing my knees had weakened. She remained standing beside her daughter. "My husband passed away last year," she began. "This diner was his favorite place, so my daughter and I still come here. It helps us feel close to him." Her daughter smiled faintly. "Daddy always ordered blueberry pancakes," she whispered. Laura smiled back before continuing. "That afternoon, I was waiting to pay when I overheard a man speaking with the manager in his office. The door wasn't completely closed." She paused. "It was Daniel." I felt my stomach tighten. "What exactly did he say?" Laura took a careful breath. "He sounded convincing." She chose the word deliberately. "He told the manager that you had become forgetful, that you sometimes wandered off, that you could become agitated if people questioned you." I shook my head immediately. "That's ridiculous." "I know that now," she replied, "but then I believed him." She looked genuinely ashamed. He sounded like a worried son trying to protect his father. I looked down at the bouquet resting across my lap. Daniel had always known exactly how to sound sincere. As a boy, he could explain away almost anything with a calm voice and steady eye contact. His teachers loved him. His coaches trusted him. Even after he became an adult, people naturally believed him before asking questions. Including me. Laura continued quietly. "He specifically asked the staff never to seat you alone." I looked back at her. "He said if you insisted, they should call him immediately." The manager's words replayed in my mind. "Your son explained your condition." Suddenly, they no longer sounded spontaneous. They sounded rehearsed. "Did he mention doctors?" I asked. "Yes." She nodded. "He said physicians believed your judgment was declining." I laughed once. Not because anything was funny. Because it was so completely false. "My physician told me 3 weeks ago I was healthier than half his patients 10 years younger." Laura's expression hardened. "I believe you." For the first time since leaving the diner, someone had said those words without hesitation. It mattered more than I expected. She hesitated before continuing. "Mr. Bennett, there was something else." I looked up. "He described you as aggressive." I blinked. "What?" "He said staff shouldn't argue with you because you sometimes forgot where you were." I couldn't even process the accusation. "I've never raised my voice in this diner." "I know. Everyone here knows me." "They knew you," Laura corrected gently, "until someone started changing the story." That sentence stayed with me. Changing the story. Maybe that was exactly what had been happening. Little moments I'd ignored began fitting together like pieces of a puzzle I never wanted to solve. 2 months earlier, Mrs. Henderson from next door had asked whether Daniel was helping manage my bills now. At the time, I'd laughed. "No," I'd answered. "Why would he?" She'd looked embarrassed. "Oh, no reason." Then there was the visit to my bank. The teller, who had known me for nearly 20 years, suddenly insisted on additional identification before allowing me to access one of my own accounts. She kept disappearing into the manager's office. When she finally returned, she apologized repeatedly without explaining why. I had assumed new procedures were to blame. Now I wasn't so sure. Even my oldest fishing partner, Carl, had started ending conversations with strange questions. You still remembering all your appointments? You keeping track of your medications? I thought he was simply showing concern because of my age. Had he been told something too? I rubbed my forehead. I've been blind. No, Laura said firmly. You trusted your son. There was a painful difference. One was weakness. The other was love. I had spent years believing Daniel was simply trying to make life easier after a leaner died. He offered to organize paperwork. He volunteered to speak with insurance companies. He insisted on helping schedule appointments. Every gesture looked thoughtful. Every offer seemed generous. I never imagined those same opportunities could become tools. Lara looked toward the diner once more. I almost never told you. I frowned. What changed? She looked directly into my eyes. When I watched you today. She pointed gently toward the entrance. You weren't confused. You weren't angry. You calmly explained your reservation, while everyone around you treated you like a problem. She paused. I realized I'd witnessed an innocent man paying the price for someone else's lies. I felt something shift inside me. Not relief. Resolve. Because if Daniel had convinced one restaurant, how many other people had already believed him? That question stayed hanging between us as I slowly stood from the bench. Somewhere behind the diner's front window, my empty birthday table was still waiting. But I had the feeling the real betrayal had begun long before today. And I was finally about to discover just how far my son's story had spread. I looked at the diner's front door for a long moment. An hour earlier, I would have walked away. Not anymore. I straightened my coat, tucked the bouquet carefully under my arm, and looked at Laura. Would you come inside with me? She didn't hesitate. Yes. She squeezed her daughter's shoulder. Stay close to me, sweetheart. The little girl nodded. Together, the four of us walked back into the diner. The conversations that had resumed after I left slowly died away again. The hostess recognized me immediately. Her expression tightened. Mr. Bennett. Before she could continue, Laura spoke calmly. We'd like to speak with the manager. A minute later, the manager emerged from his office. His polite smile faded when he saw me. Sir, I thought we already discussed. We didn't, I interrupted. You told me what my son said. You never asked me a single question. He shifted uncomfortably. We were acting in your best interest. Laura stepped forward. Were you? He looked at her. I'm sorry. You said you were protecting him. Then explain exactly what Daniel Bennett told you. The manager glanced around the dining room. Nearly every customer had gone quiet. A waitress stopped refilling coffee halfway through. An elderly couple near the window exchanged puzzled looks. The manager lowered his voice. This really isn't an appropriate place. I think it is, Laura replied evenly. You embarrassed Mr. Bennett publicly. You can explain publicly. The room became completely silent. The manager let out a slow breath. Mr. Bennett's son visited several weeks ago. He looked directly at me. He said he was deeply concerned about your cognitive decline. My what? He claimed your doctors believed your judgment was deteriorating. My doctors have never said that. I understand that's what you're saying now. No, I replied firmly. I'm telling you it's false. The manager hesitated before motioning toward the reservation stand. He opened a folder. I probably shouldn't. Then he stopped himself. No, given what's happening, you deserve to see this. He removed a printed sheet attached to my reservation. I stared at it. Across the top in bold letters, someone had written, "Special customer instructions." Below it were several typed notes. If Mr. Noris Bennett arrives alone, do not seat him. Contact son Daniel Bennett immediately. Avoid discussing financial matters. Remain calm if customer becomes argumentative. Delay service until family arrives. At the bottom, Daniel's personal phone number. I felt every eye in the room move from the paper to me. My hands remained perfectly steady. I've never been argumentative in my life. The manager nodded. I know that now. But you believed it then. He lowered his eyes. Yes. A woman seated near the counter slowly stood. I knew that name sounded familiar. Everyone turned toward her. She pointed toward me. Your son spoke at our neighborhood association meeting. I frowned. When? About 2 months ago. She looked apologetic. He told several of us your memory wasn't what it used to be. Another customer spoke up from 2 booths away. I remember that. So do I, an older gentleman added. He asked everyone to call him if they ever saw you looking confused. Each sentence hit harder than the last. Laura looked at me quietly. This wasn't just here. No, it wasn't. A retired mail carrier raised his hand slightly. I hate to say this. He looked genuinely uncomfortable. But Daniel stopped me outside the post office once. I turned toward him. He asked whether I'd noticed you forgetting conversations. I told him no. The man shook his head. He laughed and said that's exactly what someone in early dementia does. My chest tightened. Daniel hadn't been reacting to rumors. He'd been creating them. One conversation at a time. One business at a time. One neighbor at a time. Until strangers began believing they had reached the same conclusion independently. The manager stared at the paper again. I thought I was helping. I know, I answered quietly. That's what makes this so frightening. None of these people wanted to hurt me. They believed they were protecting a vulnerable old man. Daniel had used their decency as a weapon. Laura folded her arms. Mr. Bennett. She waited until I looked at her. I don't think this started with the diner. I nodded slowly. I don't either. She took a careful breath. I've remembered something. What? I saw Daniel somewhere else. Where? She looked toward her daughter before answering. An attorney's office. The word stopped me cold. He wasn't there by accident. She met my eyes. And after everything I've seen today, I think I finally understand why. An attorney's office. I repeated the word slowly, trying to understand why Daniel would have been there. Laura nodded. It was about 3 months ago. She glanced at her daughter, who had quietly taken a seat at a nearby booth with a coloring book the waitress had brought over. My husband had only been gone a few weeks. I was meeting with an estate attorney to finish the probate paperwork. She looked back at me. Daniel walked out of one of the conference rooms while I was waiting. I frowned. I don't remember him mentioning any attorney. He wouldn't have, she replied. At the time, I assumed he was helping an elderly parent with legal planning. It seemed perfectly normal. She paused, but I couldn't help overhearing one sentence. What was it? He asked whether medical documentation would be enough to obtain guardianship, if the parent refused to cooperate. A heavy silence settled between us. The manager looked from Laura to me. I don't know much about guardianship. I do, I said quietly. My wife and I discussed it years ago after her father developed Alzheimer's. Laura nodded. Exactly. Guardianship isn't something people casually ask about. No. She shook her head. Especially not with the questions Daniel was asking. My pulse began to quicken. For the first time all afternoon, the pieces were no longer scattered. They were beginning to connect. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. There was one person I trusted completely. My attorney. Martin, it's Noris. His familiar voice answered almost immediately. Noris, happy birth. He stopped. You don't sound like yourself. I need to ask you something. Of course. Has my son contacted you recently? There was a brief pause. Then Martin sighed. I was hoping I'd never have to answer that question. My grip tightened around the phone. So he has. Several times. Laura looked at me without speaking. What did he want? I asked. He requested information about durable powers of attorney. My stomach dropped. And I told him those documents require your direct authorization. He didn't have it. No. Martin's tone became more serious. He kept insisting you were becoming forgetful, and that it was only a matter of time before you couldn't manage your affairs. The manager's face turned pale. Laura slowly lowered her eyes. Everything she suspected was becoming real. Did you prepare anything? I asked. I drafted nothing. Martin answered firmly. I refused to move forward because you never contacted me yourself. Relief washed over me for only a moment. Then another thought surfaced. Martin. Yes. Did Daniel say anything else? There was another pause. He asked whether witnesses from the community would strengthen a guardianship petition. I closed my eyes. Witnesses. The diner. The neighbors. The bank. The post office. Every conversation Daniel had been having suddenly made perfect sense. He wasn't simply spreading rumors. He was building a record. A false one. The kind that would look convincing, because each person believed they had reached the same conclusion independently. I think he's been collecting them, I whispered. Martin immediately understood. What happened today? I briefly explained everything. The diner, the reservation, the printed instructions, Laura overhearing Daniel weeks earlier. When I finished, Martin spoke without hesitation. Noris, don't go home yet. Why? I want you at my office within the hour. His voice carried an urgency I'd rarely heard. And bring anyone willing to give a statement. I looked at Laura. She nodded before I even asked. I'll come. The diner manager stepped forward. So will I. The elderly woman from the neighborhood association raised her hand. I heard Daniel myself. The retired mail carrier stood. I'll testify too. One after another, people who had unknowingly become part of Daniel's deception began stepping forward. Not because anyone asked them. Because they finally understood what had happened. Martin spoke again through the phone. Noris. Yes. If Daniel has been telling the same story to this many people. He has. Then he may already be preparing to file. My heart skipped. File what? A petition asking the court to declare you incapable of managing your own life. I looked around the diner. Just an hour ago, every eye in the room had viewed me with sympathy. Now those same people were looking at me with something entirely different: determination. The manager walked back into his office. When he returned, he carried a folder. I almost forgot. He handed it to me. I printed every email Daniel ever sent us. I opened it. There were dates, messages, detailed instructions, each one carefully crafted, each one another piece of the story he wanted everyone to believe. Without realizing it, Daniel had documented nearly every lie himself. My phone buzzed. A new voicemail notification appeared. The caller ID read, Daniel Bennett. Before I could even think about listening to it, Martin spoke sharply through the phone. Don't respond. Why not? Because if I'm right. He stopped himself for half a second. He's about to learn that the people he counted on as witnesses have just become witnesses against him. Martin's office was only 15 minutes away. By the time we arrived, the conference room was already prepared. He greeted me at the door with a firm handshake, instead of the cautious sympathy I had seen all afternoon. It's good to see you, Noris. You too. He looked around the room. I understand several people have volunteered to speak. Laura stepped forward first. So have I. Behind her came the diner manager, then the retired mail carrier, the woman from the neighborhood association. One by one, each person introduced themselves. None of them knew one another. Yet every story pointed to the same man. Daniel. Martin opened a legal pad. Let's build a timeline. For nearly 2 hours, everyone described their encounters. Laura recalled overhearing Daniel privately warning the diner weeks earlier. The manager produced the printed customer instructions and every email Daniel had sent. The neighborhood resident described Daniel's speech at the association meeting, where he encouraged neighbors to contact him if they noticed me acting confused. The retired mail carrier explained how Daniel had tried to persuade him that ordinary conversations with me were signs of dementia. As every statement was recorded, Martin quietly organized them by date. When he finished, he turned the legal pad toward me. The pages told a story I never could have imagined. Daniel hadn't acted impulsively. He had been building this narrative for months. Every conversation had the same purpose. Every lie reinforced the previous one. Every person unknowingly became another potential witness. The diner wasn't the beginning. It was simply the latest piece. Martin folded his hands. I think we should expect him. Expect him. If he's preparing to seek guardianship, he'll eventually discover that you've learned what he's been doing. He didn't have to wait long. Less than 30 minutes later, Daniel walked into the office without knocking. Dad. He looked around the conference room. His confidence faded almost immediately. The manager from the diner sat beside Laura. The neighborhood resident recognized him instantly. The retired mail carrier folded his arms. Daniel's eyes settled on Martin. I'd like to speak with my father privately. Martin shook his head. No. This is family business. No, I replied calmly. It stopped being family business when you involved strangers. Daniel looked back at me. Dad, you're misunderstanding everything. Am I? You've been forgetting things. I haven't. You've needed more help lately. I accepted help. There is a difference. He forced a nervous laugh. I was only protecting you. Laura finally spoke. By telling businesses he was mentally unstable. Daniel froze. She continued. I heard you. The manager slid the printed instructions across the table. I followed these because I believed you. Daniel stared at the paper. That isn't what I meant. Martin opened the folder containing the emails. Then perhaps you'd like to explain these. He laid them out one after another. There were dozens. Every message contained another warning, another exaggeration, another attempt to convince someone that I couldn't be trusted to make my own decisions. Daniel's shoulders slowly dropped. He looked at me instead of the documents. Dad, when? I interrupted quietly. When did you decide I was worth more to you, declared incompetent, than I was as your father? He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Martin spoke next. Mr. Bennett, you've also contacted my office repeatedly regarding powers of attorney and guardianship. Daniel looked genuinely shaken. I was just asking questions. Questions don't require false statements about your father's mental health. The room fell silent. For the first time in his life, Daniel had nowhere left to hide. Not behind charm. Not behind concern. Not behind carefully chosen words. Every person he had manipulated was sitting in front of him. One by one, they had dismantled the story he spent months creating. A week later, Daniel formally withdrew the guardianship petition before it ever reached a hearing. Martin immediately filed documentation preserving every email, witness statement, and communication in case another attempt was ever made. Daniel was removed from every account, authorization, emergency contact list, and financial responsibility connected to my affairs. My bank updated every instruction on my accounts. My physician documented that I remained mentally competent after a complete evaluation. The neighborhood association corrected the false information Daniel had circulated. The diner owner personally visited my home. I owe you an apology, he said. We failed you. You were deceived, I answered. So were many people. The following Saturday, they invited me back. Booth 7 had been reserved. Not because it was good publicity. Because they wanted to make things right. When I walked through the front door, the entire staff greeted me by name. No suspicious glances. No whispered conversations. Only respect. I placed the bouquet beside Alina's usual seat. For a moment, I simply smiled. Then Laura and her daughter arrived. You saved my birthday, I told her. She smiled. I think you saved your own. Her daughter carefully placed a small daisy beside Alina's flowers. My mommy says your wife would have liked these. I felt my throat tighten. I think she would have. Life didn't return to what it had been before. It couldn't. Some betrayals permanently change the way you see people. But they also reveal who chooses to stand beside you when it matters most. I updated every legal document myself. Martin remained my attorney. Trusted professionals, not family pressure, handled my future planning. Laura and her daughter became regular parts of my life. Two families marked by loss found unexpected friendship, because one woman refused to stay silent when silence would have been easier. As for Daniel, he lost far more than access to my finances. He lost the trust he had spent 44 years building. Trust, I learned, isn't destroyed by one terrible decision. It's destroyed by hundreds of small lies that finally meet the truth. The next year, on my 73rd birthday, I sat once again in booth 7. I looked at the empty seat, where Alina had once laughed across the table at me. Then I looked at the people who had chosen honesty over convenience. Losing my wife had taught me how precious love truly is. My son's betrayal taught me something just as important. Never surrender your dignity simply because the person trying to take it shares your name.